Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Geoffrey Cain. Geoffrey is a foreign correspondent, an author, a commentator, as well as a scholar and anthropologist. And on today's podcast we're going to speak about his recent book, something that he spent years embedded in. And this is titled Samsung Rising, the inside story of South Korean giant that set out to beat Apple and conquer tech. Throughout this podcast we're going to build up the story of Samsung, its origins and its foundation, in Daegu, and with Lee Byung-chul, who was then a citizen of the Japanese Empire. His early trading ventures, his step into building his first store, Samsung So, or the 3-star shop. And of course from there it just grows and grows. It moves into breweries, universities, newspapers, department stores, insurance companies, banks. And before long, Lee Byung-chul is suddenly the richest man on the peninsula. But of course, how he gets here is what really matters and what it takes to sustain this place in the world and in Korea. This is a story of intermarriage, of close relationships with government, of authoritarianism and corruption. A company that successfully marketed itself as the hub of Korea, as the Korean nation itself, the Minjok. And yet at the same time was reaching out to Japan, or later the West, specifically America, for the expertise it lacked in South Korea and for the corporate culture that it wanted to develop. And that question, that corporate culture, matters so much here because we're going to drill deeply into 3 key crises. The corruption scandal involving Park Geun-hye and Choi Soon-sil. The 2015 scandal concerning the selling of shares and mergers in order to secure the position of current Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong as head of the company. And of course the events surrounding the failed launch of the Galaxy Note 7, which literally exploded and caught fire in people's hands. What runs through this is a top-down militaristic structure, a corporate culture that is a world unto itself, something that has made the company hugely successful and also presented the liability for crises like these. A quasi-religious culture, or how it is sometimes referred to in South Korea, emperor management. I'm going to link Geoffrey Cain's book below and I encourage you to go and read it for yourself. We skim over entire chapters throughout this podcast. There just simply wasn't enough time. So to fill in some of the details for yourselves, you will have to read the book, and I can't recommend it enough. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the PayPal or Patreon link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated, as is recommendations for future guests. On that, and to talk us through the story of Samsung in South Korea, this is Geoffrey Cain. Geoffrey Cain, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jed.
So today we've been talking about your newly released book, Samsung Rising. Now, this is going to be linked below for everyone that wants to go and read it for themselves. I do encourage them. I read through it in the last week. Absolutely gripping and informative. But it starts with yourself and yourself in Korea, at least in the first paragraph, in the first chapter here. So I might get to introduce just where you start off, because it's an interesting point and it's going to build up throughout the story itself. So you start with these phones exploding in planes and in people's pockets. And you start with yourself in the country itself and some questions that you begin to ask. Things like you talk about the corporate culture and the idea that there's an existential problem. So what brought you to the subject? How did you find yourself involved in this issue and introduce your book through there? So, yeah.
Yes. So thank you, Jed. That's interesting. Good way to start, actually, because I have a lot of thoughts on that, on the exploding phone. So just for our listeners who might not remember all of this, in 2016, late 2016, there was an incident at Samsung in which they had released a phone called the Galaxy Note 7 that was supposed to be their flagship device. It was supposed to really turn things around. It was going to be the big phone that beat Apple, that that made Samsung a brand name that could produce a great phone. And it really was a great phone until it became clear that they were igniting in the hands and pockets of users. That Samsung realized too late that these phones had gone out, that they were dangerous, that they were a risk to public safety. And Samsung ended up recalling them after a very long delayed, just a messy bureaucratic process that Samsung had made all kinds of errors and they weren't communicating effectively. They weren't really being clear on what exactly the danger was and what consumers needed to do. And after Samsung recalled this was in September 2016, they released replacement phones that they said were safe, but then these phones also started to ignite and in a similar way were a danger to the public. I mean, there was one case where a man was grounded on a flight. He was on Southwest Airlines flying a domestic flight within America, and the flight had to be grounded before takeoff because his phone ignited on the airplane. And, imagine if that had happened while it was in flight. That could have been a disaster. I mean, this is smoke that, when it ignites, the smoke that it's giving off is full of all kinds of metals and dangerous chemicals and circuitry that's, burning in the air that people should not be inhaling. So, yes, a major public safety issue. Samsung was slow to treat it as a problem, and internally, many Samsung executives were in denial. They were in denial that such a great company, a mega corporation that has conquered the world of technology all over, could do something so silly, could do something so terrible. So when this happened, I was living in Seoul, and I had lived in Seoul at this point for about 5 years, on and off since 2009. And I had been a reporter, so I was writing for The Economist and for Fast Company and Time Magazine. I had been actually brought to Korea originally to report on Samsung. I had an assignment from the Fast Company to tour their headquarters, to tour their buildings and talk to their executives and get a sense of what this company was. And so I had spent, about 5 years just watching this company, talking to people, talking to the top executives, interviewing for, the founding family, interviewing, just doing as many interviews as I could to understand this company for my reporting. And many people told me about these instances where this kind of thing would happen. They said, I was working at Samsung and there was a mistake. And so the system shut down. The system, meaning the leaders who run this top-down management system where people can't question what their leaders say. They can't question the conclusions of the company or the products they're making. They say that, there would be a mistake, say, in the power supply for a phone, or, there was a pass mistake in a display. The display was faulty. And when these mistakes get out, the company just shuts down and they can't communicate. They can't. They refuse to address the issue until it's really too late and until it becomes a major crisis, either on the market or with their partners, carrier partners who they're working with, or with the customers themselves or government regulators. So as I was in Seoul, watching this unfold, I was, I was meeting with, Samsung executives, Samsung employees. They were kind of giving me, you could say, like, kind of underhanded updates, like unofficial updates on what was going on internally that, the company couldn't talk about publicly. And it actually, it was quite strange, to be honest, because I found that it was strange, but also not surprising, because it was as if history had been repeating itself once again, over and over and over. And now it had reached the point where a phone was actually a major problem, was a major public safety hazard. I mean, it had reached the point where Samsung simply could not just, take this back and say, we're sorry, that, it actually had to make amends for it. But internally, Samsung was in denial. Executives were saying that these reports can't be true, that you shouldn't talk about them. They told the employees, they said, don't talk about these reports. They're not true. They're falsified. They're made up. People are just out to get Samsung. It's the media's fault. The media has made this up. They would say, for example, that there are reports that iPhones were also igniting and iPhones were a danger to the public. But the media and the shareholders and the general public, they were converging on Samsung because they had an agenda against Samsung, an agenda against Korea, that they were going to take down Samsung, and this was all just a conspiracy and a hoax. And this is literally, I mean, this is no exaggeration. This is literally the kinds of things that they were telling me. So when Samsung did initiate this recall, I was actually meeting with a well-known, a prominent in his circles, battery expert, a battery engineer in Korea. His name is Park Geun-hye. And he was actually doing his own tests and doing his own forensic investigation of these batteries that were igniting in this phone. He had gone on and looked at all the YouTube videos. He was interviewing, people who had their phones ignited. He was doing his own independent investigations to try to figure out what the cause of this was. And very early on, he told me that he believed Samsung got it wrong, that they had recalled this phone, but that the phones that they had released again were still going to be dangerous, that they did not actually, do something that would solve the problem because they were in denial. And he saw that everywhere too. He said that, he was going on Korean TV and, he was giving his commentary, what he believed was the problem with the batteries of this phone. And Samsung executives would call these news outlets in Korea and, they would tell them not to quote this guy, not to talk to this guy because, he was somebody who didn't really know what he was doing. So I was gathering all this material. And at this point, I knew I wanted to write a book about Samsung. And so at this point, I guess you could say within Korea or, among foreign media in Korea, I had become something of the Samsung guy. And, when people needed information that they thought would be objective and reliable on Samsung, they usually just called me and I would kind of go through it with them and tell them what I had been finding. So I had gone on some news outlets. I had gone on NPR. I had gone on CNN, gone on Bloomberg TV. So basically kind of the usual lineup of business-focused television networks. And I would give this commentary. I told them, that this is a result of the corporate culture, that Samsung is a military-like top-down company. Internally, I'm hearing reports that they had suffocated the bad news, that, there was going to be a problem. They might have known that this would happen. And immediately, I got pushback from Samsung. There were angry emails sent to these journalists who had interviewed me saying that I was a self-declared Samsung critic, that I was making inappropriate commentary. Many of these journalists were called. They were essentially summoned to the Samsung offices. And, Samsung said they wanted to meet them and they wanted to scold them and correct the record on why commentators like me are simply outsiders who don't really know what we're talking about, and we're just out to get them in this grand conspiracy. It really was something. So, you asked why did I, start in the first chapter with myself as I'm witnessing these events. And the reason is because as these phones were exploding, me as a journalist, usually a journalist is kind of on the outside of the story, but I actually ended up becoming a part of the story because Samsung started launching all these counterattacks against me, trying to discredit me, trying to take me down and trying to show the world that I'm somebody who can't be trusted and that other people who question it can't be trusted. So I think that by itself speaks to the, I don't mean this as a criticism of Samsung, but just the way the company works or has worked in the past, that it's a company that's very built on this conglomerate model, this Korean chaebol model, and for listeners who don't know, chaebol is a wealth clan, and that's one of these big firms like Samsung and Hyundai that built the Korean nation. It's a model that really is built on size and top-down execution, in which a leader sets a vision and the executives are supposed to execute it. And when the execution happens, there's not supposed to be any questioning. And that questioning should also not come from outsiders. If the people who make the product, it's supposed to go out and it's supposed to contribute to the national economy. And the detractors and the critics are essentially attacking the nation itself, or attacking the idea of the company and not just one product. So that's what happened here, and that's why I thought it was good to, in a very unconventional way, to actually put myself in that story and to tell it that way.
So that's a great starting point here. And you mentioned a few times there that you went down to Daegu. You didn't mention Daegu, but you went down here and you began investigating and looking into the foundations of this company and where it came from. So let's begin to build this story up a little bit. And at the end of it, we'll come back to what you just said there, and it'll become more obvious for listeners about that corporate culture and some of the challenges that you mentioned there. So let's go back to the very foundations of this country with the first chairman, Lee Bang-chul. And how does this all start? You write here that it begins in 1938 with a vegetable company. So how does it start from this vegetable company translated to the three-star shop, or Samsung Sangho? And this begins to wind through it. So it starts under Japanese colonization, and then moves into the Sangman-Rhee era and Park Geun-hye. So take us to the rise of this company, this extraordinary low start, and then just how it began to snowball into something so large in those early years.
Yes. So Samsung is not the company that we know it today. We know it today as a smartphone maker, as a television maker. People say that it's a respected brand name, but it wasn't always that way. And I think this is what separates a company like Samsung from, say, Apple, which has a clearer trajectory and a clearer product line, a clearer focus. Samsung is essentially built on a mixture of the Japanese and the Korean models of industrialization. And this is something that I think over the decades, it's been whitewashed a bit in Korea. But when I say the Japanese model, I'm not talking about the Japanese model like Sony and its Walkman players. What I'm saying is that Samsung is built essentially on the imperial Japanese model. It's built on the Japanese colonial model of industrializing a nation and building a company. And that model is built on a handful of major companies that were called the Zaibatsu back during the Meiji era of Japan. So we're talking late 19th century to World War II. The Zaibatsu, it means wealth clan, which is actually the same translation for chaebol in Korean. It also means wealth clan, and they also share the same Chinese character, which I find really interesting. So you can see how linked these two concepts are, and how in many ways they're just inseparable. There's really not much that would separate them culturally and socially and economically. So Lee Byung-chul, or we can call him B.C. Lee, that's what he would often call himself in English. He was the founder of Samsung. He came from a landowning family, and he was from the southeast. He was from a town called Oryong, which is a small village that actually had quite a few, interestingly, chaebol heads come from. Some of these families came from this area. This was an area that was favored by the various Korean governments for a while, favored for development. So it's understandable that a lot of people from this region, would be successful. They had government backing. But he founded this under Japanese colonialism. So this was in 1938. It was called Samsung Sanghae, which roughly translates into the Three Stars shop, or the Three Stars trading store. And it was started back when Korea was a dusty colony, and especially the southeastern part of Korea under Japan at the time wasn't really an area with much promise. It mostly produced rice for the Japanese Empire. And what had happened was that B.C. Lee had, a couple of years earlier, he had started a rice trading venture, because that was what Korea was. It was a rice trading center for Japan. But it failed quickly because there was a credit crunch. He couldn't get money from the banks because they were directed by the empire to focus on funding the war effort that was starting to grow then. So B.C. Lee took some time off. He traveled to what was Manchuria at the time, which today would be northeastern China. He studied the market, and he was looking for gaps in the market, and he found that opening just a very simple trading shop that would import or ship in some kind of vegetable goods and dried fish. Dried fish came from Hong Kong at the time. Just importing this in and then selling it to a mixture of local people, but also the Japanese military and the Japanese overlords would be the way out. He wasn't. So I just want to clarify that in Korea, there are a lot of accusations against him that he was a collaborator. That he set out to work with the Japanese, at the expense of the Korean people, which is one of these polarizing narratives. In Korean politics today, there's this public anger over who is a collaborator and who's not, and the shaming of supposed collaborators still continues more than 70 years after the Korean War. B.C. Lee, the reality, of course, was so much more different. I mean, it was so different from how it's depicted today. But B.C. Lee was very much a businessman. He didn't really have major ideological leanings. He realized that he had to work with the Japanese if he wanted to run a business, because that's just how business was done in Korea. And so he continued working with the Japanese and eventually bought a beer brewery a couple of years later. And the beer brewery was important because there were only a handful of licenses in Korea at the time to make beer, and they were almost exclusively controlled by Japanese companies. So this ability to get this license shows an early instinct that he has to warm up to power. He knows how to make political links, whether that's with Japan or with the Americans later, or with the Korean government, the dictatorships that would come a little bit later. He knows how to work his way into elite networks and social circles, and he knows, how to either, give the right money, get the right license, meet the right persons, kind of wine and dine them, and get that license so he can expand his business. So beer in Korea, because it has such an incredible small number of producers, has a very high profit margin. It sells for a lot of money, and that was the moment that his business started expanding and grew into something that would be significant for the years to come. But of course, so World War II ended in 1945. The American military shows up, and he continues doing the same process where he set up a kind of secret society, and he would meet with these Korean managers who worked for the American military that they were present in Korea after 1945 to help create this new Republic of Korea that was founded in the late 1940s. And he keeps expanding. He moves to Seoul from Daegu. He decides that he really wants to make it big. And at this point, Samsung is a construction and trading company. So he's witnessed that there is a construction boom happening in Korea after the war is over, World War II. But Korea doesn't have a mixture of the materials that it needs to fuel this, and the manpower. I mean, Korea is just not a big place, and there aren't enough people to build a nation that quickly. So Samsung very early on becomes not just a company, but an idea. And the idea is that, yes, Samsung will build a profit, for BC Lee, but Samsung is also tied to the prosperity, the growth, the health of the nation. And he wants Samsung to be great, just as he wants Korea to be great eventually. Now, unfortunately, the Korean War hits. That's in 1950. It goes until 1953. BC Lee's business is looted. He's questioned by North Korean communist authorities. He does manage to escape. And using this political savvy, this ability to just know the right people and just to get through hard times, BC Lee, while his colleagues are being executed by firing squad because they're capitalists and American and Japanese collaborators, BC Lee makes it out. He spends time down in Busan, which was the last stronghold of the Korean War for the Allies, the United Nations forces. And then finally, after the war is over, he returns to Seoul and he sets up political networks with the first president of Korea, who is Lee Sik-man, or in English often called Syngman Rhee. And Syngman Rhee, of course, he's basically a strongman. He starts out, he's the first president of this young republic. It's extremely corrupt, violent, lawless. And Lee Sik-man starts out this idealist. He's this Christian man who was educated at Princeton, and he's married to this Austrian princess, I believe it was, some kind of Austrian nobility, and they're running this young nation. They're setting out to build it. But people like BC Lee realize that the strong are going to survive. I mean, this is not a place for idealists. Korea is not a place where you can just trust other people. And BC Lee actually wrote this in his book. He talks about the careful, meticulous manner you need when you're going to decide who to trust and who not to, because the wrong person can really cut you down and steal your money. So the success of BC Lee at this period, this is the 1950s, is the same exact thing. It's his ability to get licenses from the government so that he can embark on a system called import substitution. This was the official Korean government policy of the time. It was an economic growth plan in which companies and entrepreneurs would get limited license so they could import goods, import raw materials from overseas. So, for example, the wool or the unrefined sugar or the timber, the lumber, and then they would process it in their factories and turn it into paper and sugar and chemicals later, and whatever else was needed at the time, clothing, wigs, very simple industry. So BC Lee, with his connections in the late 1950s, is probably the richest man in Korea. It's not totally known who was the richest at the time because there were so many hidden assets, but he is the one of the wealthiest people, but he's also reputed to be one of its most corrupt. and a symbol of Korean corruption. He's both admired as a symbol of the national reconstruction after the war, but he's also hated as a man who's plundering and profiting and seen as bullying his way into these monopolies and suffering his critics and going after people who disagree with him, paying off politicians. So maybe one of the closest examples, I think that American listeners might be familiar with the 19th century and with Andrew Carnegie and the tycoons of the oil era, the Second Industrial Revolution, the Thomas Edisons and those types of characters. He very much has that character. He's a tycoon. He runs a newspaper. He runs a university. He controls politics. He has links into the political system. He's a guy who knows how to be ruthless, but also knows how to inspire the people who follow him. Now,
I might pause on that moment there, because you mentioned this a couple of times there. So before we jump into Park Geun-hye and the era a little bit more, there is one thing that does come through your writing, and you must have encountered this a lot. And this is really important for the Samsung story, for where it's going to go, and for explaining some of this corporate culture. And you write, and this is from the chairman himself. He writes these things. There's an ad that goes out in these early years, and it says 50 years with our Minjok. Now, for people listening, the Minjok is I suppose it means Korean race in a way. And you write here, this is quite an interesting way to think about this. You write, Samsung wasn't about sales or operations or economic policies. It was about patriotism and spirit. Samsung tapped into feelings, emotions, and a sense of belonging. It offered Koreans a promise of glory. And that is an interesting way, because you were talking earlier about your visit to Daegu, and you bump into people that say things like Samsung built this country. And there's sort of a reverence beyond just a corporation. So I might get to drill into that before we jump into Park Geun-hye. That different kind of place that Samsung sits in the minds of Koreans, and at least back in that day, how Samsung was such a central important to feelings and emotions beyond just a corporation making money.
Yes, so I think a lot of the history of Korea that's been written so far focuses on the policy, the economic plans, 5-year plans, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the military officers who all came together and started building Korea. But I think that there hasn't been enough written on this phenomenon of the Minjok, the nationalism that you're talking about. So it means, I guess you could translate it as like kind of a national community or a Korean race or kind of an ethnic nation. I've seen a lot of translations of that word. I guess there's no specific translation that would totally make sense in English, but it connotates this idea of this community of people who come from a shared bloodline, and this bloodline has some kind of characteristic or something that runs through it that must be superior, and it comes from an ancient bloodline. I mean, it's something that goes back years and years and decades and centuries, and it's something unique to the Korean people. A concept that ironically was introduced in Korea by the Japanese colonials when they wanted to convince Koreans that they were these long lost cousins who had a shared destiny together, that they were in this together. Yes. So I think that, a lot of Korean history, a lot of these cable groups, Samsung, Hyundai, it's not just Samsung, it's a lot of different phenomenon in Korea. It's, the growth of Korea, the building of Korea as a nation from absolute poverty to what it is today, to this technological powerhouse. A lot of that comes from the inspiration that a generation had when they set out to make this nation great. They were truly inspired. And when I was writing this book, I wanted to go back and I wanted to talk to a lot of these older executives who had joined Samsung, as early as the 1960s, and they had spent their entire lives there. And they remembered what it was like to wake up in the morning and to stand while they played the company song, and to put on their company uniform and wear the company pin, and then to go on a march outside, to go on a hike together with their fellow employees. I mean, they remember the feeling of what it was like to walk into the factory. They're going to make semiconductors, and they would sign a pledge. They would write an oath, and they would say, "I will make Samsung great." They would write something like, "I will make Samsung great, and I will make my nation great, and I will not fail you, Samsung." These are the kinds of slogans that Samsung employees from a young age had been filled with. I mean, they were filled with it all day long. It was a part of their training. It was a part of, their just the kind of indoctrination. That's the exact word that they would have to go through. And when I'm talking about this kind of thing and interviewing people about it, it really brings to mind a famous quote by Napoleon. Napoleon said that people don't die so they can get a little badge or a little medal. They risk their lives and they risk death because they're inspired to something greater, that you have to electrify their spirit. I don't think that it's possible to build any nation through the technical aspects alone. I think that looking only at the policies in place and the incentives set up and the economic modeling that was done, I think that can only explain one part of the story. To get people to work like that, to get people to work those grueling 20-hour days where they're literally putting their lives on the line. They're exposing themselves to hazardous chemicals, and they can't join a union. They have terrible working conditions by modern standards, and they're putting their lives on the line because they believe in this cause of Samsung and, by extension, of Korea. They truly believe that they're a part of a great project and that they're going to do something historic and that they'll be remembered. And this is not just something that executives told me, but even in Samsung's internal booklets that I had obtained and I had gone through, the Samsung chairman, Lee Kun-hee, who's the current chairman, he actually wrote this. He said things like, we're going to make our nation great, that Samsung is at the vanguard of the nation, and it's the businessmen first who lead the way, and then the nation is following behind them. And he would say things like, we have to make our company proud, but also our nation. And then he would say, our families, our descendants, and our ancestors will think of us when we go through with this historic moment in building Korea. So I think all of this speaks to the power of what it means to have a profound place in the world, and to see the world as something that you can shape and something that you can alter, and you can create your own destiny. And that destiny in this case is building Korea into a highly defendable nation with technology of its own, so it can never again be colonized by Japan or meddled with by America or Russia or China, that it is a nation that stands strong, that has its own technology, and that can fend off foreign invasion. That's the line of thinking.
So let's step into the Park Geun-hye era, and of course, Samsung semiconductors as well, because of course this becomes such a vital thing and such an important thing for people listening today. When they think of Samsung, they think of the phones in their pocket. So Samsung semiconductor comes about, but at first you have this new chairman, and there's as you said before, there's a change of government, a revolution of sorts on the streets, and a change. And Park Geun-hye brings in the chairman of Samsung and presses him. I suppose he brings in a lot of heads of the chaebols. Park Geun-hye came to government talking about reforming the chaebols. Of course, he didn't do much reforming, but he brought people like the chairman in, and it basically impressed upon them that they should work together in this tight collaboration. Now, you mentioned the chaebols before, so let's talk about just that, really into how intermeshed Samsung became with the government at this time, and I suppose also the launch of Samsung semiconductors.
Yes. So after this coup d'etat in 1961, Park Geun-hye takes power, and Park Geun-hye, just to give readers some background, is a leader who was trained by Japan and trained by the Imperial Army. He spent time in Manchuria, which was the base of the Japanese war effort. And one of the things that he admired was the Meiji model of Japanese industrialization. This is state-led industrialization in which the entire nation is supposed to be fired up through these big conglomerates, 3 or 4 big conglomerates to make the nation great, to make it powerful. And he even had a saying, rich nation, strong army. But Park Geun-hye, he looks at the Korean situation as he's taking power, and he looks at people like B.C. Lee, and he looks at Chung Ju-young, he looks at these chaebol heads, these families, and he just sees so many of them as absolutely backwards. He actually wrote this. He said a lot of this in his speeches, and his colleagues remember him saying this. he looked at them and he thought that this family model, this dynastic model of running a business and trying to pass it to your kids is just so incredibly against what a modern Korea should stand for in every way. So he knows that there are triggers that he can pull. He knows that there are, tactics he can use to get these companies in line. But he also knows that they're extremely wealthy and powerful, and they ultimately control a lot of the assets that the nation depends on, to build things up. So he meets with B.C. Lee. B.C. Lee was golfing in Japan when this coup d'etat happens, and two Korean agents showed up at the door and told him to come home. So eventually he came home. B.C. Lee was quite lucky as the richest man in Korea because a lot of his peers were put in jail. They were just rotting away in jail cells, and not all of them got out. And B.C. Lee strikes a deal with Park Geun-hye, and they say that B.C. Lee will put his resources and put his efforts to developing the nation. And in exchange for this, the Korean government will slap his wrist a bit, will make him pay, tax evasion penalties. He might have to give up some businesses here and there. But as long as he builds the nation, then Park Geun-hye will give him some kind of tentative support. The key word there is tentative. So one of the big nation-building projects at this point is fertilizer. And this is what a lot of countries do. Fertilizer, being able to make your own fertilizer is extremely important for farmers, for food sustainability. And Samsung is about to open the world's largest fertilizer plant to this point. This is in the mid-1960s. It turns out that some of the chemicals that were being imported from Japan to make this fertilizer were being sold on the black market for an extra profit, which was a crime against the project of national development. So Park Geun-hye's government comes in. They say, what we're going to do now is we're going to arrest and convict your second son. So his second son was a man named Lee Chung-hee, who took responsibility for this black market sale. And B.C. Lee is forced to step down and surrender 51% of his fertilizer business to the government, to the state. So, if you put yourself in B.C. Lee's shoes, you have to see how devastating this is, because this fertilizer plant, he had invested so much, in today's money, it would be billions and billions of dollars in making the world's largest fertilizer plant. And then this is with government coercion and government backing. And then when it's done, it looks to him like the government's coming in with an opportunity and saying, we found the dirt on you, and now we're going to seize your plant that, you just invested in. It looks like a shakedown to a guy like B.C. Lee. And I think this is what really reflects the Korean pattern. This is where it starts with these chaebol groups. It's that the chaebol groups behave badly. They have bad corporate governance. They have a long history of corruption and cronyism, and they do a lot of crazy things to try to get their kids into power in particular. And the government knows about this. They know what's going on. They're well aware of what the shady deals are, and they come in at opportune times when they need to use it against them. They slap these chaebol leaders on the wrist. They give them a prison sentence, but then maybe they'll get a pardon a year later, and then they're let off, and then things are back to normal. So it's this unhealthy pattern of chastising followed by connivance. And it continues. This has gone on since the 1960s under Park Geun-hye. And in the end of this fertilizer scandal, B.C. Lee appointed his first son, a man named Lee Mang-hee, who passed away recently, actually, to be the chairman in his place. But Lee Mang-hee is a brash manager. He orders his top executives to come into his office and kneel before him, and he yells at them about how superior he is. He's rumored to be mentally ill and unfit to lead this big company. And B.C. Lee, who is completely aghast at the chaos that he's created in Samsung, returns in 1968, reinstates himself as the chairman, and declares that his first son is essentially banished. He goes off and lives the remainder of his life in this little fishing village down in southeastern South Korea. And, he's cut off financially for a while. He can't even afford a bus fare at one point. He's convinced that, Samsung executives are plotting to kidnap him, and he has all these crazy stories. I don't know how many of those are true, but he is rumored to be mentally ill and has a lot of problems in his life. So it really is a tragic ending for him. And, even his Korean biographer called him the Prince Saro of Samsung. Saro was a prince who in the 18th century was kind of similar. I mean, he was going around and he was just angering people. He was kind of crazy. He was a bad leader, and his father, the king, locked him in a rice chest and had him basically killed, starved him, for a few weeks, and then he just died. So this is the kind of dynastic drama, the types of patterns, the types of kind of unhealthy leadership styles that I think pervade the Chable, and that, starting at this period just continue. So it's, that's really the most dramatic part of the book, I would say. When I was writing it, I was kind of shocked at how bad some of this drama got.
So let's step towards some of the later drama. We're going to have to skip over so much in the middle of this book. I can't encourage people to go and read it as much for themselves. But before we get there, we have to talk about, I suppose, the launch of the Samsung phone. Now, this is a challenge for them because at first it seems they don't quite understand just how important smartphones are going to be. They are confused. At first it seems the Korean government actually bans the first iPhone when it does come out, and you're right here. It's under this veiled protectionist policy, but throughout all this, there's this feeling here that made in Korea, and you right here, the phrase "made in Korea" was a laughing stock. And you got these wonderful quotes from people like Bruce Gordon, and he's contacted about Samsung and about joining their design team, and he writes, "Yeah, they make terrible stuff." And there's this internal fight within Samsung to suddenly go from this company that's making money and producing things well to suddenly then being a company that is competing internationally with Sony and then with Apple itself.
Yes, and it's incredible. It's an incredible story. So when B.C. Lee died, he died in 1987, and his third son, the current Samsung chairman Lee Kun-hye, took over. He wanted to instigate this campaign of rejuvenation among Samsung employees because they had declared themselves the number one in Korea. I mean, at this point they were making semiconductors. They had grown under his father's watch enormously, and they had the favor of government administrations. It was a powerful and a wealthy company. They had succeeded at implementing the vision of B.C. Lee just enormously, but the question is, okay, so the Cold War is ending at this point. This is the late 1980s, early 1990s. It's an era of free trade agreements. There's NAFTA. There's the WTO, the Uruguay round. This is an era when borders are opening, unlike today. And Lee Kun-hye, the Samsung chairman, is this erudite loner. He's a bit of a scholar and a bit of an eccentric. He reads alone in his room. He watches 8 movies in a day, sometimes in a weekend. He has a prescription drug problem. He's hooked to opioid painkillers. I mean, kind of an interesting reclusive character who has all these quirky habits. And he comes out and he tells his employees in 1993 that this is not working, that you cannot be number one in Korea forever, that he uses this phrase, you need to change everything except your wife and children. And it's a phrase that Samsung kept drilling into its employees for the years to come. It didn't always work, but he did manage to instigate some kind of change to get his employees to think a bit more globally about what was coming to them. So this led to a lot of progress. You mentioned Gordon Bruce, for example, who was a top designer at Samsung for a long time. It did lead to a lot of progress because Samsung went overseas, to America, to Silicon Valley, to New York, also to Europe, to India was another big spot. China, expanded, opening design centers, trying to get more marketing talent, software talent, people who weren't simply hardware engineers, who could make this a truly global company that knew how to do marketing and software and content and, the softer side of this technology business. So because of this, bringing in people like Gordon Bruce, there was another marketer named Todd Pendleton, who I spent a lot of time with. Samsung, does make a lot of progress becoming a global company. They made a huge leap against Japan, which was their number one enemy for a long time, against Sony, particularly in TVs. They learned how to design a beautiful TV that wouldn't just be a black box in the corner. That's what people used to have back in the 90s. And then later, after beating Sony, Samsung had this problem. They were complacent. It was a repeat of history. It was a problem in which they they looked back and they said, okay, we beat Sony, and now I guess we can sit back. And nobody really realized that by then. This was 2007, and the iPhone had been released, and there was this iPhone onslaught coming, and Samsung was going to get whipped up into shape. They were going to have to beat Apple. The problem was nobody really realized this because there was no iPhone in Korea. The iPhone was effectively banned. There was a Wi-Fi platform that phones had to use, but the iPhone didn't support it. It was a silly protectionist measure. It wasn't something that really mattered that much in terms of the operability of the phone. But finally, a couple years after the iPhone, that ban was released, and there was a flood of Apple iPhones entering Korea. That was the moment when Samsung executives said, like, oh shoot, we have a big problem here. We are about to get clobbered again. And that really brought them back to what their chairman had been saying all those years. His mantra was perpetual crisis, change everything. And he was trying to get his executives not to be complacent, not to sit around and be so proud with their success and just enjoy the profits that were coming in. It's a common theme in the technology world. And when this iPhone came in, they decided that they were in trouble because they still hadn't mastered some of the basics of how to effectively build a top-notch product, a top-notch smartphone. So once again, the Samsung executives who were being sued by Apple at this point for copying the iPhone, they decided they had to go to Silicon Valley in particular. They had to hire software developers, software talent. They had to hire more designers, more marketers. They really wanted to do what Apple did, in the sense that Apple had been so successful at building not just a phone, but the entire experience. So when you buy an Apple, back then, you would go to an Apple store, you would get the phone, and then Apple would control the entire user experience. They would control the software. They would control the apps, like what goes on there. There were not many viruses, security concerns. Like, it was a very well-built phone because it wasn't so much about the hardware, the outer rim itself on the phone, but it was more about the content that you were accessing. It was about the world you entered when you opened your iPhone and looked at it, and you could play music on your iTunes. You could, watch movies, like early movies back in the day. It really was a revolutionary device that changed, in the world we live in today, really created a lot of, how the world works and how we go about business, how we meet people, how we consume content. It really was revolutionary, but Samsung did not have this. And for Samsung to have that, they would have to do things like, make a phone, but then also control the software, make the music app, make the video streaming app, make their own, operating system called Tizen. They would have to, improve their design, improve their materials. They would have to open Samsung stores, make good Samsung commercials. Like, to this point, Samsung was really just a manufacturing company that was making phones and then, trying to compete with Nokia, which was not a very important player at the point. So Samsung hired a marketer named Todd Pendleton, who was based out of Richardson, Texas. He was a former Nike marketer. He had spent a lot of time working with NBA stars, so he had signed LeBron James. He had led the team that signed Kobe Bryant, and he was respected within sports marketing circles. That's exactly what Samsung wanted, because they didn't want to just be seen as a phone company. They wanted to be seen as a cultural company. They wanted to have something like the Just Do It, the Swoop, the Swoosh. They wanted to have a logo that people could recognize, and they would connect with it. So Todd Pendleton came in. He launched a very smart marketing campaign, also controversial, called The Next Big Thing Is Here. And the idea was to attack Apple head on, to create a two-horse smartphone race. So not a lot of people remember this, but back in the early days of smartphones, it was either that you bought an iPhone, and the iPhone was the premium phone, or you bought one of many other, phones in this muddy mess, in this mess of competitors that nobody really cared about. You could get a Nokia, LG, HTC, And, BlackBerry, you could get a Samsung among them. Nobody cared about Samsung. Todd Pendleton's goal was to attack Apple head on and make fun of Apple fans in these commercials, because then by doing it, it's not about beating Apple. It's more about elevating Samsung to that level of Apple. So people will say, hey, are you getting an Apple or a Samsung? Instead of, are you getting an Apple? It worked. And I remember, when I was first writing this book, I was watching these commercials and talking to marketers and, kind of thinking like, this is silly. I mean, this is not going to work because they're just giving free advertising to their competitor. They're giving free advertising to Apple. But it worked because their internal marketing research had suggested that Android users, Android is the OS used on Samsung phones, saw themselves as smarter and more independent in their choices, and they saw themselves as people who, valued the ability to customize and to play around, to tinker. They saw themselves as not like they were sheep. Whereas they looked at Apple fans and they saw them as these sheep who just worship Steve Jobs and just do what he says, even though they have no idea about the technology. They don't really know what they're doing. And it worked because what Samsung essentially did was it found this tribe of Android users who needed a leader, and they positioned themselves so that Samsung could be that leader. And that's one of the reasons why today we have the Apple versus Samsung. And, that's why it's not the Apple versus the HTC or something like that. So, very successful. But in the end, it really is a tragedy because a lot of the marketers who did all this great work were chased out. The Korean headquarters didn't really like their work, didn't trust them, audited them a number of times, and was quite offended that they had outdone their bosses and perhaps even made their bosses look bad. A lot of them were just, were not welcome anymore. A lot of them had the narratives written against them and, were kind of forgotten in the company. But I spent a lot of time with them, and I wanted to tell that story because I think that the Apple versus Samsung story has never really been told. Like, we all know Steve Jobs, we know about the history of Apple, but I don't think many people have really written much about, how that war actually unfolded.
So from there, let's make another large jump forward here to one of the things that happens towards the end of the book, and this is fascinating. And for economic novices like myself, it's a little bit challenging, but you do lay it out in great detail here. So in 2014, the chairman has a heart attack, I believe, and and of course the ascension crisis is back on, and the new chairman is going to be Jed Lea. And you're right, he's facing a tax inheritance bill of $6 billion. And then to put that in perspective, you put down here that the United States expects to collect $16 billion in total this year itself. So this is a $6 billion bill for one person, and America is going to collect $16 billion in this type of tax themselves for the whole country. And suddenly you're right, the Samsung mechanism, the war machine gets into gear. They've been planning for this. The royal ascension begins to go, and they begin and to make sure that this new heir actually gets control, because he may have to sell off some shares and lose control of the company in a certain degree here. He begins to make a couple of deals that perhaps feel slightly normal inside South Korea, even though there's a lot of controversy as well. But outside the country, they are incredibly dubious. So let's take us to that fight for power, the deals that are being made, and I suppose the outrage largely from Manhattan.
Yes. So this storyline, it's a story of power, and it's a story of dynasty. What happens when a dynasty seeks to keep absolute power within its reigns? I don't know if you've seen, there's a show on HBO called Succession.
Yes, I have.
Yes, so it's similar to Succession. It's a story of shareholder warfare. It's a story of drama, of infighting, of family dynasty, battles, and just regulators coming in. It really is truly something out of it's something out of Succession, or something out of some corporate drama that shows all these crimes being committed. So what happened? You are right. So May 2014. The chairman had a heart attack, and then later he had a stroke, and he's been incapacitated since then. Hasn't been seen in public. He's been in a hospital suite at the Samsung Medical Center, and Samsung is very quiet about his health. you don't really see a lot of reliable information out there about what the state of his health is. So this is a problem for Jed Lee, and Lee Jae-yong, as he's called, or Jed Lee, he is the heir to the Samsung empire. He's the only son of Lee Kun-hye, relatively untested, hasn't really done a ton, that in a typical public company would make him a leader that shareholders would vote for. But the reality is that he's the heir, so he doesn't have to prove himself. He's guaranteed to get this company in the end anyway. But still, regardless, this poses a huge problem for Jed Lee because he has the $6 billion inheritance tax that's split between him and his two sisters. He's going to have most of it, of course. But the problem is that he hasn't built up enough of a stake so he can control enough of Samsung, of this empire of 50 affiliates, to assume control as the next chairman while also paying this inheritance tax. So if he gets the bill, he might have to sell his stakes in Samsung, which would dilute his authority over the company just to pay this tax. So that's a problem. So if his father dies, what that means is that he's in big trouble because he might not become the next chairman of Samsung. This is what he's been preparing for his entire life. So Samsung, to get around this, they have to find a way to raise his value in this empire. And the reason I say empire is because there is no one Samsung company and there's no Samsung conglomerate. It's a loose network of companies that own shares in each other that are all under the control of this founding family. So it's really an empire that's, that is controlled by one family. And the Samsung executives decide that they're going to merge two companies. They're going to have a company called Chael, which runs the theme park of Samsung, acquire Samsung C&T, which is construction and trading, and that's the construction arm of Samsung. So from the outset, this did not rub well with shareholders at all. Like, first of all, why would you merge a theme park company with a construction and trading company? I mean, it's just like a hodgepodge of units that really don't make a lot of sense. And then on top of that, the terms of the merger were absolutely terrible for the shareholders of Samsung C&T. So they were getting 1/3 the value of every Chael share when this merger happened. And essentially, I'll spare everybody the financial details. It gets really complicated. But in the end, what this does is it essentially gives away the company at a negative value to Chael. So basically, the shareholders are getting ripped off. They're totally feeling ripped off. They feel that Samsung is basically diverting their shares, diverting their value to Chael for the purpose of elevating Jed Lee to the chairmanship when he's not even proven. I mean, nobody really knows much about him. So this ignites a major shareholder battle. There is a New York hedge fund called Elliott, run by a man named Paul Elliott Singer, comes in and condemns this move, claims that it is illegal, and that they'll fight it in both the courts and at both the shareholding vote when the merger is set to be voted on. So Paul Elliott Singer is he's been called the world's most feared investor by the New Yorker magazine. I mean, he's somebody who, if he has invested in your company, if he owns shares and he comes knocking on your door and says, I have a proposal, you better be scared if you're the CEO, because he's going to try to take you down. I mean, he's the type of guy who will unseat you. He'll put his own board members in. He'll try to get the shareholders on his side. He is a hostile, antagonistic hedge fund manager who uses his money and his influence to try to get companies to change their bad management practices, to conform with the laws of economics and the laws of the market. So this is an example of an instance where Samsung is not following the laws of the market. They're following the laws of the Lee family at the expense of everybody else. So as this happens, Samsung attempts to mobilize the nation. They run all these commercials. They go serenade the shareholders and give them baskets of fruits and all these gifts and things, and they're trying to get Korean shareholders to connect the well-being of Samsung with the well-being of Korea. And in the process, Elliott management and Paul Singer, they start getting attacked by an anti-Semitic media campaign in Korea, which is just incredible. I mean, I was connected to a lot of the key people. I was interviewing them as these events were unfolding. And then suddenly there are all these articles that come out in the Korean media in these business tabloids like the Mail Kyungjae, so like the Economic Daily, these types of papers. And they accuse they accuse Paul Singer of being a Jew. And he's Jewish. They accuse him of being a Jew, and they say that Jews have outsized power in the world, that there's an international financial conspiracy consisting of Jewish elites, that the American government is under the sway of Jewish money and Jewish capital, and many of these shareholders are a part of a Jewish conspiracy to meddle in the Korean nation. I can't make this up. It just got so insane, and it got so outlandish and so vindictive and nasty.
But it's also so explicit too, right? They're not even pretending to hide this or talk out the side of their mouth. This is open anti-Semitic sort of behavior that you wouldn't get away with in other countries.
It's open anti-Semitic behavior, and it's open from the papers that are most supportive of Samsung and other chaebol groups. It's like they have no conscience whatsoever. And even as this was happening, there were Jewish protection and human rights NGOs that were writing to them and complaining and talking to the Korean government. And as long as this stayed in Korean, it wasn't an issue. It's like nobody wanted to bother with it. They just left the articles up. They didn't issue apologies. The turning point was when Samsung C&T published a presentation on its website for shareholders. And it's like a public, totally open and out there. And it was a cartoon that showed, like a comic book, a manhwa, as Koreans would say. And it showed Paul Singer as a vulture with this giant beak who's going around the world and stealing sacks of gold from, poor children in the Congo and plotting with these evil overlords, like in this international conspiracy to destroy people, like it was just totally ridiculous. And there was a hilarious article. It was in the New York Observer. I remember I opened the internet and just saw this first thing on my feed. And it was a side-by-side of the Samsung cartoon with Der Stürmer, which was the German Nazi newspaper from 1938. And it shows Samsung's depiction of this Jewish hedge fund manager versus this Nazi depiction of some evil Jewish guy with a beak, as the Holocaust is about to start. It was just just so blatant and so open. And, once this happens, so this starts to gets more into the English media. And once it hits the English, American, kind of British, Australian media, suddenly it's a big issue. And then suddenly Samsung takes it down and apologizes and, pulls the advertising from all these anti-Semitic newspapers. And it's suddenly, we realize that there's a problem with anti-Semitism. There's where we've just, realized that this is a problem. I mean, it's just one of the most bizarre sagas I've seen in a business dispute ever. I mean, can you think of an example where two businesses, accuse each other of being Jewish and, or anti-Semitic?
Certainly not companies of this kind of caliber anyway. No way. Yeah.
No, not at this caliber. So, yeah. So Samsung did take it down in the end. So the merger did, they held the vote for the merger. There were some protests in the room. There was a man who stormed the microphone and said that he opposes the merger. It's terrible. And then in the end, the merger went through. And the merger went through with the help of a group called the National Pension Service, which is Korea's pension service, which is charged with paying out, retirement pensions to the Korean people, which, the Korea has an aging population. They're going to depend on this fund for the decades to come for its payouts. And that means that they need to have good investments to do those payouts. But it turned out that Samsung had bought horses for a crony affiliated with the South Korean president at the time, Park Geun-hye.
Well, let's jump into Park Geun-hye then, because this is great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is the second part of this scandal, and I suppose we can tie these two together at the same time as they begin to clash together here. This extraordinary thing. Let's jump into Park Geun-hye, because this, for some people listening who may not know a lot about Samsung other than phones, they may have paid attention to when Park Geun-hye was being impeached. And it wasn't just her on the dock, it was also Samsung. This goes back to just before this particular crisis that we're talking about before with the shareholders. And it is this meeting of these two minds, these two sons and daughters of basically a Korean royalty, is not too much of hyperbole to say. And it begins with a missing tablet and the shadowy figure of Choi Soon-sil and the bribery and corruption. So let's take us into the other side of this, which is happening almost simultaneously, which is the Park Geun-hye scandal.
Yeah, so as this merger is happening, people are scratching their heads and saying, why did this merger go through? Because after the merger went through, the stock tumbled. I mean, there was no gain. There was absolutely no value to gain from this merger going through from Sam's, like, just nothing for shareholders, nothing for the public. It made absolutely no sense. So why would they vote for it? Why would a company like the National Pension Service, which had a big stake in Samsung, vote in favor of this, even though they knew internally that they were going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars if this merger went through? And that came out very shortly thereafter, about a year later. There was a missing tablet that surfaced in the hands of Korean journalists at JTBC. And the tablet showed that there was a mysterious, shadowy, they call her Korea's Rasputin. She's the shadow behind the scenes. And maybe that's a hyperbole. I don't know if she's quite a Rasputin. I don't know how much she was actually controlling. But she certainly had the ear of the president. And she had this ability to read her speeches before she gave the speech, to look at her itinerary, to make suggestions and make edits. I mean, she was even involved in buying, buying like fashionable clothes for the South Korean president. So this in itself was a scandal because this woman, Choi Soon-sil, she had no government clearance. She wasn't a government employee. So why did she have all this access to the president's internal affairs? And it turned out that she was the daughter of a cult leader, a religious figure, who had, back when Park Geun-hye was reeling from the assassination of her parents. So her father was assassinated, as was her mother. This family of strange religious figures came in and, convinced her to become like a part of sort of their club, befriended her, started getting control over her. And there were even rumors that they had total control over her body and soul. I mean, that's literally what some of the U.S. Embassy cables said when they were writing back to Washington on this. It really was just out of this world. I mean, it's down the rabbit hole. And this story gets weirder and weirder and weirder. I mean, we've already been through anti-Semitism, and we've been through shady cult leader, and now we're going to be into horses. Horses as brides. So this cult woman, Choi Soon-sil, had a daughter who she wanted to be a horseback rider and equestrian. She wanted to compete at the Olympics and become, something of a global star in the equestrian world. So President Park Geun-hye approached Samsung and said that she wants them to sponsor the equestrian team of Korea and to buy horses for the competitors. And the competitor would be the daughter of this crony. So Samsung executives conceded, and they said, okay. So they bought horses for this woman, and she was training. And, when I say buy a horse, this is not a small sum of money. For Samsung, it's small, but it's $800,000 for one horse. So that's literally, I mean, if you're a star horseback rider, that's the kind of money you have to be prepared to spend, or your patrons have to spend to make you really that good. So Samsung buys these mysterious horses. And it turned out later that in exchange for buying these horses and paying outright bribes in the form of about $40 million in bribes, the South Korean president's office interfered in the vote via the Ministry of Health, and then down to the National Pension Service, put political pressure on them to vote in favor of this merger to allow Jed Lee to become the next heir to this Samsung empire. So because of this, this is a major revelation among the Korean public, and protests blew up everywhere. So these protests were in Seoul. I was in Seoul at the time. I was in the Foreign Correspondents Club, and I could look down, and I remember seeing these, hundreds of thousands of protesters. That was the police estimate. The largest protests in the history of the democracy of Korea. That would be since 1987. And just seeing, them holding up candles and smartphones, and it looked like little fireflies, luminescent in the distance, floating around, and they're shouting on their smartphones that Park Geun-hye has to step down. So what was surprising about this was that the prosecutors not just came in and arrested the South Korean president, but they ransacked the Samsung offices. And remember that Samsung is essentially untouchable in Korea. It's a godlike company. And they ransacked the offices, they arrested 4 executives, and then they arrested Jed Lee himself, which was a shock to so many people. And I say a shock because nobody really thought that he could be arrested. Nobody thought that he could be put in a jail cell and that he could be sent to trial for a crime like bribery. There were past cable leaders who had been tried, but most of them were never actually arrested. They just go to court and they're tried. And this trial dragged on and on. This was the first time, I think anyone really got to see Jed Lee speak in a public forum in the court. Samsung has kept him very secret. They don't want people knowing what he's up to. They're trying to protect his reputation. They don't want his failures to be exposed publicly. And as he was on trial, he talked about, how he wasn't really running the show at Samsung, which was truly strange. He said that he had people who were running the shareholding game for him, but that he wasn't involved in the business and he was just reading news every day on technology and electronics and the industry. But he didn't really know what was going on, and you should just blame the lower guys, the executives, for that. So basically, Jed Lee admitted that he's incompetent. In this situation, either you're incompetent and you should know what's going on, or you're the mastermind and you were the one behind it. Either way, you're not going to look good. And what I read from this trial was that Jed Lee said, yeah, I don't know what happens in my company, and I am an incompetent leader. I've interviewed a lot of people who have, worked with Jed Lee. Some liked him, some did not like him. But one of the biggest takeaways from most of the interviews was that, he's this heir, but he growing up, he didn't really have a sense of what his company was all about. I mean, he didn't know the names of some of the units of, some of what Samsung was selling. He just seemed kind of clueless and a bit of an adult. And I got that from the trial too, that he's just a bit clueless, and, he's about to take over the world's largest technology conglomerate. And he doesn't know what his own executives are doing with his own shares that he owns, It's totally bizarre. And that's where Succession comes in. So HBO Succession, the son, there's the story, there's the father, there's the son. The son is kind of a bit of a dolt, and, he has a drug problem, and he's not really that smart, not good at running the business, but he's still kind of rising and trying to become the next leader of this media conglomerate. So Jed Lee's at trial, and then finally, I think one of the most shocking things about writing this book was the moment that the judge delivered his verdict. The judge said that Jed Lee is guilty of bribery and perjury and embezzlement, and that he's going to be sentenced to 5 years in prison, which is an incredible amount of time for a chaebol head, and especially the most powerful chaebol head in Korea. There have been past convictions, but they're almost always let off with a presidential pardon, or they're given a suspended sentence, which means they don't have to serve any time. But this time, the Samsung heir Jed Lee was actually brought to prison, and he served a year of his prison sentence before he was let off. And he was let off because an appeals court in the Korean tradition, and this was also kind of a shocker, but not that surprising, the appeals court upheld part of his bribery charge, but then let him out and said, you don't need to serve all 5 years. We're going to suspend your sentence, and you're free to go. So the Supreme Court just recently overturned that ruling and said that the lower court was not that it's starting to get complicated, but they said that the lower court didn't really use a good definition of bribe, and they should have included more horses as bribes. So Jed Lee is now on his last trial. This is a retrial of his appeals court trial, and it's a retrial, and they're going to determine whether or not he's going to go back to prison. There's actually a good chance that he might go back to prison, and the leader of the Samsung empire, the ascending chairman, he's still vice chairman, the ascending chairman will be in prison, will not have a future at this company. But that's still up in the air, and I'm waiting to see what happens. It's a hanging ending.
So as a final question here, And this runs through a lot of what you're talking about there. You mentioned the chaebol at the end and how these people tend to get convicted over time, but always pardoned. And it's always this claim, and it has happened in other parts of your book that we haven't mentioned here, but it comes back to this claim of they're better outside of prison making money for the nation and making us strong than inside the prison doing nothing. And this had this thought in my mind because at 2 points here, first, during the share challenge, and then during the trial of Jay Lee, you talk about being on the streets with these people and these opposing supporters. One side is saying things like Samsung built this nation, you must support them, and the other side saying things like one side saying Samsung built this nation, and the other side saying Samsung bought this nation. And it's this, and for me it sounded a little bit like Korea might be in a changing moment. I'm not sure how you look at this. So I might, as a last question, get here to think just the place that Samsung and the chaebol now hold in the Korean mind. Do you see that it's changing much from that old idea of they made us a strong country to now a more modern look of they are corrupt and now they are poisoning the well through bribery and corruption and nepotism? Or do you see this as a largely an unchanged system in companies like Samsung? Do you think that the workers and society are now viewing companies like Samsung differently?
Yes, so it's a tough question because I've been watching this topic for years and years, and I still can't make up my mind on where things are headed because I can actually see a bit of both happening. So I actually ended up writing an epilogue for this reason. I wrote an epilogue because I ended with the trial of Jay Lee, but we had this question of, well, is the pattern going to continue or is it not going to continue? Is this going to be the Republic of Samsung forever? Or will he actually go to prison and stay there and serve an actual sentence for the crimes he's been convicted of? It is a really tough question, but I think that there are a lot of social changes, long-term social changes that have been happening in Korea for decades. And this is nothing new. It's a very slow change. It's a very understated process. But I think just to give you an example, Samsung has a very hard time retaining young talent today. It used to be that if you joined Samsung, you were pretty much there for life and you were guaranteed to get some kind of rank that was respectable in the company. But that kind of culture has dried up, and most young people, if you're an educated young Korean, that usually means that you speak English. You might have a degree from overseas somewhere, and certainly a degree from a good Korean university. The average person that Samsung is looking to hire can also go get a job at Google or get a job at Apple or get a job at Nokia. Korea is a part of this global marketplace today. Samsung is a part of the global marketplace, and there's nothing, unlike in the past, that would stop young talent from just, getting a job at the Apple office in Seoul or, the Apple headquarters in Cupertino. I think that, these companies look for a lot of the same thing that Samsung looks for now. The only difference being that Samsung demands the absolute loyalty, this unwavering loyalty for its leadership, who are doing very unfathomable things. Crimes and bribery and embezzlement. Like, why would you want to serve leaders who are repeatedly in and out of jail and they're a liability for the company? They're depressing the stock price. I mean, it's not a good long-term bet. But on the other hand, there has been a ton of complacency from the Korean government. I think that of all the disappointments in this storyline, I think the Korean government is the weakest link in all of this. I think that Moon Jae-in is not that serious and not that strong when it comes to chaebol reform, especially the reforms that he had promised. I think that it's become very clear into his administration that it's going to take him a ton of political capital, a lot of work, lots of effort to even try to break apart these chaebol and to try to do some kind of antitrust, like an antitrust campaign, like trying to get rid of some bad leaders or spin off ineffective companies and make them independent. I think that it's just these chaebol groups are just too big and they control too much of the Korean economy. And once President Moon goes in and tries to attack them, they're going to attack back. They're going to go right back after him. We can see this in his decision, for example, to bring Lee Jae-yong, when he was a convicted criminal, to North Korea. So a few years ago, there was this diplomacy between the South Korean and North Korean governments, and Moon Jae-in visited North Korea for a very rare summit, the first summit in more than a decade with North Korea, with Kim Jong-un. And interestingly, by his side was a delegation of business executives, many of whom are convicted criminals and have not served a single day in prison. Jay Lee was in that group. He was out of prison, but he was still a criminal convict awaiting his next trial. And it's just, I find it amazing that, at a high-profile diplomatic summit, these kinds of people are the ones that the South Korean president chooses to represent the nation of South Korea. I think it's quite sad, to be honest. I mean, I can't imagine this. I don't think many people could imagine this happening in their own countries. I guess, maybe Donald Trump or somebody might pull something similar at some point, but even then, that would be extremely controversial. I mean, look at Finland and Nokia. I mean, I just can't imagine if the leader of Nokia was a convicted criminal that, the prime minister of Finland would want to bring him around on international diplomatic trips, representing Finland. I think it would look a bit ridiculous, to be frank. So that complacency, I think it's a bad sign. And, even if there is social change happening at the bottom or among the middle class, it takes a while for that to trickle into actual policy and law and government. There might be quite a delay. So I think the more likely scenario is that Samsung is going to stay put and Jay Lee is going to stay put. I think that Samsung is going to continue as it's going to be doing, but I think that the glory days are behind it. I think that Korea Inc. is really starting to look a little more like Japan after the bubble burst. I don't think Korea will have as bad of a bubble as Japan had. I think that it will be moving along at a stronger pace. But it's not going to be like competing with Apple with the coolest smartphones. I think a company like Samsung is going to be kind of traipsing along with the latest semiconductor, the latest display. They're going to be making hardware, but they're essentially going to be, another China, another Huawei. I think that Samsung is going to have a lot of trouble in the next decade, differentiating itself from what Huawei is doing or Xiaomi. I think that ultimately these companies are going to start to be grouped together as kind of the same club of hardware engineers making components for the big brands around the world.
So that's a great point to leave this on, with that look into the future there. And as you were speaking there, I just realized how much tech details and how much economic detail we had to brush over during this podcast. So the book that we've been speaking about today is called Samsung Rising: The Inside Story of the South Korean Giant that set out to beat Apple and conquer tech. I'm going to link it below, and I've mentioned a couple of times how much we had to skip over. Whole chapters were missed in this podcast. So please go back, buy the book, and read it for yourself. There is so much more there. On that, Geoffrey Cain, you've been very generous with your time. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jed.